I'm very happy to share our church's first God-wink story with you, because I'm sure there are many here who have their own God-wink experiences. I really hope there will be many of you who want to share your very own stories about God has touched your life too. God-wink. Just what is a God-wink? The word God-wink was invented by a man by the name of Squire D. Rushnell. Squire Rushnell is an American author and an inspirational speaker and a former very successful television executive. Squire is deeply religious, and he invented the word God-wink while writing his first book about coincidences and answered prayers, which he titled When God Winks. Rushnell describes a God-wink as, quote, an event or personal experience often identified as coincidence, so astonishing that it could only have come from divine origin. Close quote. This is a God-wink story I have intimate knowledge of. I've called it a God-wink in the minefield. It begins. When Robert was a very young boy, he listened with great attention to the stories his grandmother would recite about her son, George, who was a decorated United States Marine during the Second World War. Although many of George's experiences were his own private nightmares, some of the places he fought were gleaned from newspaper articles Robert's grandmother read each day as the war raged, and from the occasional letters George would send to her through the military's mail system. And what also really impressed young Robert were pictures of his Uncle George in his Marine dress uniform, with the dark blue, almost black-colored blouse, with the rows of colorful campaign ribbons, and the brilliant white-colored uniform hat with the gleaming gold U.S. Marine symbol, the eagle, globe, and anchor. Robert, Bobby, was deeply impressed by the vision and stature of his uncle, and through the years, as he entered his teen years and his interest grew, he would hear and sometimes read stories about the history of the Marines, the historic battles they fought, and how they were considered one of the finest fighting forces in the USA. Bobby was an average general studies student in his 1960s high school, and he didn't seem to excel at anything particular. For sure, he had interests in several areas, but due to a lack of focus, his grades were nothing to brag about. And he just wasn't sure exactly what he wanted to do with the rest of his life after high school. But one thing that did dominate a lot of his attention was the military conflict that was taking place in Vietnam. Each evening, the television news would broadcast segments featuring the Vietnam conflict and the United States' ever-increasing involvement in that war. Some of the stories were deeply troubling to Bobby, who was very patriotic and deeply loved his country. Week by week and month by month, Bobby's inner thoughts began telling him that it was his patriotic duty to serve his country. And in June of 1966, as his high school graduation approached, he had already made the decision to enlist in the Marine Corps, just like his Uncle George did so many years before. In late September of 1966, at just 18 years old and only 3 months after graduating high school, Bobby left his high school sweetheart behind and boarded a train headed for recruit training at Parris Island, South Carolina. During the hectic 8 weeks of intense boot camp and physical conditioning, the Marine staff were constantly evaluating and testing the recruits. And based on aptitude test scores, each Marine recruit was assigned a military occupational specialty, MOS for short. Although every Marine is trained for the basics of infantry combat as so-called grunts, Bobby and several others in his platoon were chosen as combat engineers, Marines trained for specialized kinds of duty. After a brief period of home leave, Bobby found himself in North Carolina for basic combat infantry training and specialized training at the Marine Corps' Mines and Demolitions Warfare School, which was his assigned MOS. After months of training in North Carolina, he was flown to California and a week later across the Pacific Ocean to Okinawa, Japan, the final stop for several months of acclimation, vaccinations, and outfitting before heading to Vietnam. Bobby arrived in Vietnam in April of 1967 and was sent to a Marine outpost outside of Da Nang to begin his in-country tour of duty. When he arrived at his outpost, he learned that he was a replacement for one of 13 Marines and several Vietnamese civilians that just weeks before, in late March, were killed instantly during a mine warfare training exercise at the very outpost where he was then assigned. But at just 18 years old, and still gung-ho from his recruit training, he didn't seem too bothered by those sobering facts, and he soon learned his duties involved building infrastructure for the Vietnamese, mine sweeping, laying and clearing mines, destroying VC and NVA booby traps using explosives, and all the while in support of different Marine infantry units. One day, Bobby's commander gathered his unit and said that they'd been ordered to report to a location not far from the outskirts of Da Nang for a special detail. Earlier in the war, other American units had planted an unknown number of landmines in a large plot of uncultivated land to protect the airfield from the Viet Cong. Now, as part of a plan to expand the airfield, the land was to be reclaimed, and of course, the mines had to be removed. The mines Bobby's unit was ordered to remove were American-made M16 anti-personnel mines, nicknamed the Bouncing Betty, which coincidentally was the very same kind of mine that had killed the 13 Marines and civilians at Bobby's first outpost. Bobby's unit had no idea of the exact number of the mines, nor were there any official maps or drawings showing the location of each individual mine. What they did know was the location of the property that contained the mines, and that the boundaries of the danger zone were surrounded by concertina wire, and that was it. That's all they knew for sure. For the folks here that aren't familiar, Bouncing Betty mines are bounding anti-personnel mines used to wound or kill when they're disturbed. They can be configured to fire with direct pressure or by a tripwire. The mine looks like a large soup can with a 3-pronged tube sticking out of the top, looking very similar to a miniature upside-down tripod. The tube part is the central fuse, which has 2 safeties that prevent accidental firing. And these 2 safeties are connected to each other by a sturdy piece of cord, or sometimes a piece of webbing. The can part is the launching mechanism, the explosives, and the shrapnel that inflicts the injuries. When it's properly planted, only the 3 prongs stick out above the surface, and they're virtually invisible in a grassy field. When someone steps on the mine or disturbs the tripwire, a series of complex actions takes place inside the can part involving fuse delays, and in its next to final action, a small black powder explosive charge launches the mine up into the air where it explodes. It's built to allow the victim to step on and then move slightly away before the mine launches to waist and chest height before exploding. It's deadly for 360 degrees all around, and it's very lethal out to about 30-yard radius. It sounds very complicated, but all of the mine's actions take place in just 1 1/2 seconds after it's disturbed. It's very quick, it's effective, and it's very, very dangerous. That day, Bobby's team of engineers arrived on site with all their equipment, and they established a base of operations and a main entry control point to the minefield. To begin, one engineer, using a handheld mine detector, sweeps a 3 or 4 foot wide safety lane through the entire minefield, and another engineer outlines the edges of that safety lane with white-colored tape. This action outlines a safe walking lane that lets the teams walk into and out of the minefield. From this main safety lane, search teams will sweep individual lanes on both sides, mark the mines they find with safety bonnets, then dig out and disarm the mines. Once several safety lanes are established, the work of finding, marking, removing, and disarming the mines runs quite smoothly, unless something unexpected happens. Extreme concentration and care is an absolute must when dealing with explosives of any kind, especially mine warfare, and search teams are always relieved on a regular basis to alleviate the stress of working with and defusing live mines. That day, taking turns at finding and removing the mines, it was Bobby's turn to work the minefield. Using his mine detector, he located a number of mines and marked them with safety bonnets. He returned to one of the mines in preparation to remove and defuse it. Bobby set his mine detector aside, laid on his stomach with the mine at his face and head, and removed the safety bonnet from the mine. Using a bayonet, he began digging out the mine when, to his horror, his helmet suddenly tipped forward from his head and struck the mine's fuse prongs. Bobby had carelessly forgotten to connect the chin strap on his helmet that held it in place on his head. Instantly, the mine tripped and began its firing sequence with a loud snap. And in an instant of absolute and complete clarity, Bobby knew he was doomed. He tightly closed his eyes and waited for the explosion. But the mine didn't explode. As he slowly opened his eyes and looked at the mine, Bobby saw that the person who had originally planted the mine failed to remove the metal cotter pin safety from the mine's top striker pin. And when the mine began its firing sequence, the still inserted metal cotter pin was struck with enough force that it was bent into the shape of a V, which prevented the mine from firing and which, of course, saved his life. If the person who originally planted that mine wasn't careless in that one rare instance among the entire minefield of 100+ mines and had removed both safety pins as was required, Bobby would have been killed instantly by the exploding mine, just as the 13 Marines were at his base outpost. Incidentally, the team Bobby was working with at that property cleared many of the mines, and not one other mine was found that would not explode. The one Bobby found and worked on and which almost fired was the only one he knew of. Years later, when rethinking that incident, Bobby realized that something very special had happened in the minefield that day. He often asked himself, how was it possible for the person who laid the mine to remove one safety and not the other, since both safeties were connected to each other by a short piece of sturdy cord? The cord connecting the two safeties was there to make sure that both safeties are removed at the very same time, and it seemed inconceivable that one safety was removed, but the second was not. The answer? Divine intervention. A God wink, either at the time the mine was laid or when Bobby's life was in immediate danger. Borrowing words from one of Squire Bushnell's books, he wrote, quote, "Among other things, a God wink is also a message of reassurance coming when you most need it, when you're at a fragile moment in your life, and when instability is all around. It might be said, in fact, that God winks are the best way for God to make himself known in your life and to provide encouragement. Think about it. If you were God and you wanted to communicate with human beings without using a human voice, how would you do it? You'd perform little miracles, wouldn't you? You'd create uplifting experiences that cause people to say, what are the odds of this ever happening? Those are God winks." End quote. By now you've probably already figured it out, but the Bobby in this story is me. Back then, in that minefield, I thought my life was spared simply because of blind, dumb luck. I just thought I was lucky. God wasn't in my life at that time. And I ashamedly admit that I did not offer a prayer of thanks to him for his God wink. my journey with God and my involvement in the church wouldn't happen for many, many years after that incident. But over the years, I've come to recognize many other times God has spared my life, brought me good fortune, helped me to make good decisions, blessed me with more grace than I could ever imagine. Or just giving me a wink of one sort or another to let me know He's up there watching, that I'm loved, and I'm never really alone. This story is just one of many God winks in my life, and I'll wager some of you folks have had them. I know I'm not deserving of God's winks at me, but I'm pretty sure that from my very beginning, in my mother's womb, He's had plans for me that I can't even conceive of. Whatever God's purpose for my life is, I hope and I pray I'm worthy and fulfill my purpose to His satisfaction. And I'll forever be grateful for His goodness, His love, His mercy, and His grace. And that woman right there, my sister Joy. Thank you for letting me share this story with you.
Thank you, Jack.